Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have the usual 2 hours of horror stories. I hope you enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's see if we can reach... Let's do 1,200 likes on this one. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this all of the time. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I remember thinking that I had never felt so small. I stood on the deck of the largest ship I'd ever seen in my life, in the middle of an ocean that stretched out to forever in every direction, with what seemed like the entire universe spread out above me. I couldn't stop snapping pictures, but not a single one seemed to capture the sheer magnitude of what I saw. My last picture had a strange sort of blur in it that I couldn't immediately place. At least until the wind shifted and a small cloud of something was blown into my face. It smelled smoky. Seconds later, watching the direction it came from, I saw more of it drifting downwards towards the ocean. I leaned over the railing and craned my neck to see where it was coming from. A man stood on the deck above me, young looking and wearing a crew uniform. He had a large cardboard box propped against the railing and was scooping out handfuls of sandy gray matter to toss overboard. I hate to admit how long it took me to put it together, but once I did, I freaked out and started swatting at my hair and coat. I had just taken in a faceful of human ash. When I looked up again, the man was staring down at me. I gave him what I hoped was an apologetic look. He grabbed the box and ran. The next morning over breakfast, I was confiding in my cabin neighbor, Anne. I told her about the guy spreading ashes and how much it freaked me out. She told me she thought it was a nice way to go out. I guess at her age, she thinks about that sort of thing more than I do. Before we could finish discussing it, an announcement came over the ship's speakers. An overly chipper voice was telling us that a storm was forecasted tonight, and for safety reasons we would all be asked to stay in our cabins from 10 p.m. until breakfast. I immediately pulled out my phone and checked the satellite maps online, but nothing I saw suggested rough seas or any kind of storm front. I spent the day relaxing. It's a cruise, after all. But the later it got, the more I found myself watching the sky. Where was the storm that was supposed to be coming? Even when time was creeping towards our new curfew, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, just millions of stars. It was breathtaking standing at the railing and seeing the Milky Way touch the horizon. My thoughts were interrupted by a crew member asking me to please move to my cabin for my own safety. It was after 10 now, and the decks were occupied only by the crew and the last few stragglers that were ushering indoors. I apologized with a smile, which the crew didn't return. I assumed he was one of the less friendly ones, but the longer he stared at me, the weirder it got. He didn't move or take his eyes off of me until I was completely out of sight. Even then, I think I saw him peek around the corner when my door was shutting. A few hours passed before curiosity got the best of me. I snuck out of my room. Not that there was anyone watching anyway, and went out onto the deck to see what this dangerous storm was. It was nothing. Not a raindrop, not a snowflake, not a single rough wave. The sea was calmer than it had been in days. Even the wind had died down completely. I wandered down the deck towards a row of lifeboats, absently staring at the gentle waves rolling in the distance. A faint voice caught my attention. I could barely make out two dark figures in the distance, one leaning on the rail and another standing and holding a large box. I snuck closer, ducking down behind the lifeboats, trying to hear what they were saying. "That's so gross." A feminine voice giggled. "Grosser than touching it?" A male voice responded. He pulled a large plastic scoop out of his box, the kind you normally use for ice, and poured a scoopful of something over the railing. After last night's discovery, I assumed it was more ash. Do you put it back in the kitchen? What if I do? The conversation devolved from there into teasing, with him randomly acting like he was going to throw a scoop of ashes at her, and her squealing and giggling and swatting him on the arm. I was about to move on when she picked up a second box and started to tip it over the railing. He jumped forward and snatched it out of her hands. Is this what you've been doing? He half shouted. I'm not touching that, she whined back. You can't just drop it all in. He wasn't teasing anymore, and her face fell at the dark look he was giving her. Why does it matter? It just does. I know you're new, but the rules are important. He gave her such a look of contempt that even I shrank back. I shouldn't even be here, he mumbled half to himself. I was supposed to be on 12. Then maybe you should go, she snapped back. He threw his plastic scoop back into the box and stormed off, thankfully in the opposite direction from me. She watched him go, and as soon as he was out of sight, she dumped her entire box of ash over the edge and left too. She was trying to look tough. For who, I'm not sure. But when she passed my hiding place, she was chewing her lip and fidgeting with the chain around her neck. I waited a few minutes before coming out and going to the railing. I looked down into the ocean below. The clump of ash had already disappeared somewhere below the surface. As I searched, another faint cloud drifted past somewhere below. I scanned the decks beneath me and finally spotted another hand reaching out, scattering ash to the sea. A cold chill crept down my spine. I looked back and forth along the decks. The more I spotted, the easier they were to find, both above and below, more than I could count. Every deck, every section, as far as I could see in every direction. Every last one of them was tossing human ash to the depths below. Anne came to check on me around noon. I had been holed up in my cabin since last night, and she got worried when I didn't show up for breakfast. I must have looked crazy, checking both ways down the hall before I let her in. I told her everything. I had to tell someone. This was just too much for one person. She patted my hand and said it had to be some kind of program. You and I are lucky. There are a lot of people that never get to see this part of the world. Some people never get to travel or sail at all. I knew she meant well, but she wasn't there last night. I needed her to understand how big this was. I made up my mind before she had even left. I was going back out there. I was taking my camera, and I was getting evidence. A little after midnight, I crept up the stairs to a higher deck. I didn't want to take the risk of running into anyone who worked near my cabin and might recognize me. Our new curfew had become a standing order on the ship, although I still saw no evidence of foul weather. The deck up here felt bigger, and it was high enough to give me a touch of vertigo when I looked over the railing. I kicked myself for not choosing more carefully. There was hardly any place to hide here. I was just thinking about moving to another deck when I heard a door open behind me. I crouched in the darkest shadow I could find, armed only with a camera, praying that my breathing wasn't too loud. Another crew member with another cardboard box emerged and started making his way down the deck. He placed the box next to the railing and looked out at the ocean for a minute. I switched my camera on as quietly as possible. I had already turned off the screen so the light wouldn't give me away, and I had a long zoom lens equipped so I wouldn't have to get close. From here, I could see every detail. I zoomed in on his face and breathed a sigh of relief. He had earbuds in. As long as he was listening to something, he wouldn't hear my camera shutter. I snapped one shot of his face just to make sure. Zero reaction. This might be easier than I thought. I backed off the zoom a little to get a clear shot of his jacket with the ship's logo. Then I noticed he was wearing a piece of jewelry. A silver chain around his neck that I felt like I had seen before. I zoomed in again to see a shining pendant dangling over his chest with some kind of symbol carved into it. I got a few shots, but none of them came out very clear. The boy dipped out of frame and I had to zoom out. He had bent over and was reaching into the box at his feet. My finger touched the shutter, waiting for the scoop of ash to be visible. He pulled out a human arm. It was charred beyond reason, but completely unmistakable. It had a hand, 4 fingers, and a thumb, and I think it even had a ring on it. Bile crept up the back of my throat and he threw the arm overboard. Cold as it was on deck, I began to sweat. I found enough focus to hold the shutter and close my eyes. My camera clicked rapidly, catching shot after shot of something I couldn't stand to watch. Eventually, my fear of being caught overcame my revulsion, and I managed to open my eyes again. I watched the boy throw his last few chunks of, thankfully recognizable, flesh over the railing. Then he just stared down into the box. I held my breath, not sure if I could handle another twisted revelation. He pulled his sleeve over his hand as a barrier and reached in. What he pulled out, I see that scorched face every time I close my eyes. I was still dry heaving in the shadows when he walked away with his empty box. I stumbled to the railing, hoping some fresh air would soothe me. Like an idiot, I ended up looking down at the ocean. I saw hundreds of them bobbing in the water. Just pieces. Every one burned to a crisp. I followed the railing towards the back of the ship, too stunned to care about being seen. The sea below was littered with human remains, with more still falling from the ship. I stood at the farthest point of the deck, watching them float away in the wake of the ship. Maybe it was paranoia sinking in, but I swear I could see a few disappearing. Someone shouted from an upper deck and I ran. I didn't stop until I was barricaded in my cabin, trying not to cry. I was pretty sure I had stayed far enough ahead to lose them. Otherwise, they'd have been breaking down my door. There was no way I was supposed to see any of that. I didn't turn on any lights that night, and I sure as hell didn't sleep. I dragged my laptop into my closet and loaded my pictures onto it. I decided not to post them until I was safe and off the ship. I regret that now. As soon as I heard noise in the next cabin, I ran over and begged Anne to let me in. She was shocked to see me so early. The first thing I did was sit her down and make her look at the pictures I had taken. She tried so hard to explain it away, but I think she realized how messed up it was. She thought we should just stay quiet and go back to our normal cruise activities. Keep our nose out of business that wasn't ours. I wanted to argue because whatever was happening was clearly shady and probably illegal. But after last night's close call, I didn't think I should be taking the risk. So I let it go. I still wouldn't leave the cabin. Anne was nice enough to sneak food from the buffet to bring back to me, and we passed the day with card games and TV shows. I even managed to sleep a little after dinner. I was wide awake, and reviewing the pictures on my laptop for the 10th time when the knocking started. They announced themselves as maintenance, saying there was a problem with the room. Anne woke up and went to answer. I swear I tried everything to stop her. Looking back, it probably wouldn't have helped. I hid in the closet. It was really the only place to hide in these cabins. I just knew that whoever was knocking, it wasn't good. And I didn't want them to know that I was here. It was over before I could even think about intervening. Anne's voice had gone from confused to muffled in an instant. It sounded like she tried to fight, but she was easily overpowered and dragged out of the room. She's not here. The voice through the wall stunned me. Probably snuck out again. They were in my cabin. If she's outside, she's fair game. Should we get a backup? Better ask the captain. I waited until the voices were gone and then took off down the hall. I wasn't even sure I was going the right way, but I thought it was the direction they had taken Anne. This ship felt like a maze tonight. I ran blindly down hallways, making wild guesses and finding more dead ends than I knew existed. I opened every stairwell I found, listened for noise, and moved on. I prayed they were still on this deck. If not, I might never find them. After what felt like the millionth wrong turn, I had to stop and catch my breath. A little clarity finally came to me, and I found the nearest door out to the deck. I looked both ways and thought I saw movement near the back of the ship, so I ran. I came around a corner to see Anne alone, gagged and bound to the railing by her wrists. With no crew in sight, I ran to her, pulled the gag off, and started untying her. She thanked me, her face wet with tears. I heard a door open behind me and worked faster at the ropes. There was at least 2 people, judging by the yelling, and one of the voices was familiar. I untied Anne just in time and yelled for her to run and get inside. I wasn't sure why, but something I had heard back in the cabin made me think she'd be safer indoors. 2 young men from the crew were rushing at me, and the first thing I did was put myself between them and Anne, hopefully giving her time to get away. I kneed the first one, the angry guy from 2 nights ago, solidly between the legs, dropping him to the deck. The other one tried to shove past me, but I grabbed him by the jacket and pulled him off his feet. I managed to stay on top of him for a minute, but he was struggling hard. I held on to whatever I could until something broke and I was shoved off and onto the deck. The first guy stumbled back to his feet. I thought he was coming for me, or maybe going after Anne, but he ran back the way he had come. I looked back towards the railing. Something was creeping up the side of the ship, so pale it was almost translucent. 4 long digits felt their way up the railings, then a 5th, a fully formed hand. Each finger larger than my whole body slid up and over the railing, skimming along the deck. It hovered near the guy I had just been fighting with. He reached for his neck, searching. He looked to me and I opened my hand to reveal the silver pendant. He dove towards me, screaming incoherently. The hand was faster. It descended on him like a cage, then wrapped its fingers around him one at a time. Everywhere the pale white skin touched him, his clothes were burned away and his skin was scorched black in an instant. Screams of pain echoed around me, and I was choked by the scent of burning flesh. I clutched the pendant to my chest and prayed it wouldn't notice me. He kept eye contact with me the entire time he was being lifted over the railing. I think he expected me to save him somehow. Driven by shock, I crawled to the edge and looked over. I could see the rest of the monster's arm glistening under the moonlight. Its skin stretched thin over bones and bulging at the joints. The elbow was crashing into the sea, where I'm grateful that everything else was hidden in the pitch-black waters below. I watched the man I had inadvertently doomed being dragged into the water, still screaming. For his sake, I hope it was quick. After the water had gone still, I heard a shout. Within seconds, I was surrounded and being dragged back inside. They took back my stolen pendant and locked me up in the little cell in the security office. They tried to interrogate me, but I answered their questions with my own. They wanted to know where my camera was. I wanted to know where Anne was. They wanted to know everything I saw. I wanted to know why they were doing this. We went in circles for a good long while. No one got any answers. Right now, I'm still locked up in security with a phone I stole from one of the crew. It doesn't have cell service out here, only the ship's Wi-Fi, and I don't have my pictures for proof. This is the best I can do. I still don't know why they were feeding that thing. I'm starting to wonder if it's the real purpose of bringing a cruise this far south. I'm pretty sure I at least know why Anne and I were chosen. Both traveling alone, seemingly easy targets, and easy enough to make up an accident for me, or natural causes for her. On a ship this size, they've got plenty more to choose from. I don't know how many others they're going to sacrifice. They spent at least 3 days chumming the waters, so I'm betting they warmed it up for a good feast. It's only a matter of how many they think they can get away with. I used to work as a missing persons detective. This is the case that made me quit. I joined the force young, 21 years old. From the start, I was always taken by the idea of missing persons cases. It was more morally straightforward than homicide, more interesting than drugs. There was a pureness and righteousness in finding missing people which was hard to find in other areas of policing. It was infaultable work. I would only ever be doing good. Of course, I spent my time walking the beat first. 6 years before I could finally take the promotional exam to make detective. And after that, it was another 4 years before the opportunity came to transfer into the missing persons department. I was truly passionate about the job, something which not many people can say. Every day I could feel as though I was truly making a difference. Delivering a presumed dead child back to their parents is an indescribably fulfilling experience. Of course, on the flip side came the crushing despair every time a case went cold. No matter how impossible the case seemed, no matter how much I reassured myself there was nothing more I could do, there was always a voice in the back of my mind reminding me that the victim was still out there somewhere. The worst thing was when we found a corpse, knowing that I had failed to save a life. There are so many out there that I never found, or found too late. I see their faces over and over again in my dreams. The perpetrators have also stuck with me. I dealt with a lot of sick people in my time. I had a lot of horrible cases. A lot of times I doubted myself. But like I said, this is the one which made me leave the profession for good and never look back. By now in my career, I was one of the most senior detectives in the department. I got the lead on most cases, and was generally looked to as someone to take charge when things took a turn for the worse. I walked into the station and was notified first thing about the call that had come through during the night. 5 children, 2 girls and 3 boys between the ages of 4 and 6, had disappeared from the same neighborhood, literally within a few blocks of one another in the same day. I'm not going to tell you their names or who they were, out of respect to them and their families. I'm also not going to give any place names or details which might give too much information about the case away. Trust me, you're better off knowing less. With the extremely similar circumstances between each disappearance, I made the executive decision to treat this as a serial kidnapping case. Normally in these situations, some creep is driven around the neighborhood in a van, taking as many kids as he can. So right away, we got to work. I know it's a cliche, but the first 48 hours really are the most important on these kinds of things. Wanting to move quickly, I and my partner went to interview one of the set of parents, and sent junior detectives to interview the others. The parents I interviewed told me that they had last seen their son the previous morning, when he had gone out to play in the front lawn. The mother had been out there supervising him, but she had had to step back inside for 30 seconds to turn off the oven. When she hurried back outside, her son was gone. Brief questions posed to neighbors gave no further clues. None of them had seen anything. The other detectives had come back with similar stories, parents turning their back for a moment, and their child disappearing in the meantime. With no leads, we began our second step, checking CCTV in the surrounding area. Luckily, the suburbs where the kids were taken from were surrounded by dense commercial areas, high streets, and shopping centers. These kinds of places always have loads of security cameras, but it takes time, accessing and checking that much footage, and we were losing valuable hours. I was able to get permission from my superiors to rope in more officers to check all the cameras as quickly as possible. Credit to my team, it only took us 24 hours to find the right piece of footage. Myself and a few of my higher-ranking colleagues, as well as the two detectives who had found the evidence, gathered in my office to analyze it. I remember that those two, only junior detectives at the time, looked a bit shaken when they brought the footage to us. When we all sat down to watch, they warned us that the contents of the clip was strange. Looking back, that was the wrong word for it. We asked them to sum up what was in the video first. They told us we needed to see for ourselves. The camera which had caught the video was at the back of a supermarket, facing into one of those street depots where food trucks pull in to unload and restock. You know, those creepy-looking alleys behind stores, full of old cardboard boxes. They always give off an eerie vibe when you pass them in the street. This particular site had openings on two public roads, which is how the perp must have gotten access. The roads were unusually quiet ones for the area, which explains how nobody noticed. The CCTV footage began with a long alley empty. Then, far back right at the end, we began to see a blurry, pixelated shape appear out of the dark. We couldn't make out what it was yet. It was still in the low-quality image stage. The shifting mass of fuzzy pixels grew closer and closer and closer, until we could make out an adult, on foot with several children behind him. We were taken aback. Unusual for kidnappers to stay on foot. This made it much harder to see how he could have taken the kids without garnering attention. Eventually, the group came within clear view, and we all let out audible gasps. A mixture of shock, confusion, and, at least in my case, fright. You see a lot of things in that job that give you the shivers, but not much like what was on that video screen. I'll do my best to describe the surreal sight that met our eyes. The man, and we could tell by his imposing height that it was a man, was wearing a disturbing get-up. He had on one of those Mr. Punch masks. You know, like the classic puppet character. An unsettling thing with a too long nose, hooked chin, and bulging eyes. The skin on the face of the mask had been painted far too pale, almost snow white, brazenly contrasting with the crimson-tinted cheeks, giving the unintentional complexion of someone at death's door. The mask was cartoonish, with heavily exaggerated angles and features, and I'm not afraid to say that it made me extremely uncomfortable. There was something about the popping eyes, with their swollen veins and poorly sketched pupils, that seemed to stare at me through the screen and pass that into my mind. And the smile, it was only a mask, but the smile gave off an unmistakable air of malice and insidious intent. When I looked at the mask too long, I felt deeply afraid. I felt as if something dark and terrible was searching hungrily for me. Whoever the creator of this visage was, they were an unhinged individual. The man wore a bizarre hat, black, shaped almost like a medieval gestures, complete with silver baubles and the end of each sleeve. The cap and bells went down the back of his head far enough that his hair was obscured. He had a strange kind of coat on, more like a robe. It had no buttons or zipper, and it was long, too long. flowing past his ankles and pooling on the ground around him in folds, almost like a miniature bridal train. The coat was formed of hundreds of colored patches, stitched together, but you couldn't describe it as colorful. None of the patches were bright or vibrant. Each was a different dark hue. Some muddy brown, some gray, some a deep maroon, some dirty yellow, some chemical orange, some inky green. Not one color was actually aesthetically pleasing, almost if the coat had been sewed with intention of causing visual discomfort. The coat had many, many pockets, far more than could ever be filled. It seemed that almost every patch had a pocket stitched into it. From two of these pockets, the two on his left and right hip, stretched a handkerchief of ribbon. The handkerchiefs were composed of a pattern of black and white alternating diamonds. The handkerchief stretched a few meters behind the man, and gripping tightly into the fabric were the children. A scan of their faces confirmed these were the missing kids we were looking for, and yet none of them looked traumatized. None of them were upset or crying. They all smiled and laughed, gripping the handkerchiefs. The strips of fabric were like those magician tricks, the never-ending ones. The children held on with both hands, 3 on one side, 2 on the other. They skipped along happily and energetically. Clearly they had been groomed by the fucker in the mask. Disturbingly, he himself also skipped. He raised his knees in jovial leaps, almost like a dance of jive. Each time he frolicked up and down, he would lift his feet, which were encased in strange pointed shoes that curled upwards. Keeping time to this eerie jig down the dark alley, the man held a wooden pipe up to the mouth hole in the grinning mouth of the mask. He was playing the same tune over and over again. It was Greensleeves. That tune has always been a personal favorite of mine. Something about the simple melody repeated over and over again is utterly entrancing. But hearing it in this setting, it was nothing but terrifying. The tune was too absorbing. It was almost hypnotic. When I listened for too long, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. There was also something slightly off about the man's playing, hard to pin down. A small discordant note every now and again. The procession continued through the alley, the haunting figure at the front leading the troop, until they passed out of the security camera's viewing range. My fellow investigators and I were gobsmacked. We had absolutely no idea what to think. Never, in any of our respective careers, had we seen anything like this. Could this really be happening? Was that eerie figure really out there somewhere? At least it did a little to strengthen our resolve. There was no way that we were going to leave those kids with somebody that insane. We quickly sent out reports calling for anyone seeing something matching the odd description of the man we had seen to come forward as soon as they could. At a point like that, witness sightings were our best bet. I made the mistake of reassuring the anguished parents that we were going to bring their children home. But as the days went by, we had to widen our search from city to district, and then, after a week, the state. We wanted to be absolutely sure we caught him. We had our first conference. We released a still photo of the security footage along with it, leading to a lot of ridiculous questions. I think it was right at the end of the first week when the first newspaper gave the kidnapper his name, the Piper. I'll admit, it was fitting. His strange outfit, musical accessory, and most of all, the way those kids were just happily skipping along next to him, as if in a trance, all harked back to the age-old Pied Piper story. The name stuck. Soon, all the press was calling him that. Then the public loved criminals with a nickname. I'll admit, even us in the station began calling him the Piper. Unfortunately, No sightings came through. Nobody had seen the distinctive figure. We were just beginning to lose hope when we got the call. A man a few towns over had spotted a man dressed in attire matching the Piper's, with the children behind him, in the alley behind his apartment building, late at night. We went over there and interviewed the man, but he couldn't tell us much more than what he had seen. It was very late, he was very tired, and he was sure his eyes had been playing tricks on him. Luckily, the building had a security camera facing the alley. We were given access to the reels of footage over the last few days, and trawled back until we found the period of time during which the man had reported spotting the Piper. This footage was watched only by me and my partner, Jeffords, in the security room of the apartment building. With a similar angle to the first video, the camera faced down the long, dark alley. The cobblers were littered with broken glass and junk. This was a much shadier district. Then we began to hear that same haunting melody. Greensleeves. It sounded as if it was coming from somewhere far off in the darkness at first, but it gradually got closer, and the closer it got, the more I began to shiver. Once again, we saw the same sight emerge as we had in the first piece of footage. The scene was practically unchanged. The Piper still wore the same disturbing mask, the same peculiar hat and coat. He again proceeded slowly, rhythmically forward, dancing through the night. Still, he held that wooden pipe to his lips and played. And still, the 5 poor children were behind him, either side. Still, they clutched tightly with both hands the long black and white handkerchiefs. But whereas before they had laughed and skipped along with their tormentor, now their faces were gaunt and tear-stained. They looked thin, horribly thin, far thinner than they had before. I had the awful thought that these children looked as if they hadn't eaten in a week, and they had been moving across the country, on foot for most of that time. They did not frolic now. They stumbled and tripped, as if they were being pulled along by the Piper and his handkerchiefs. Yet still they gripped the fabric. Still they refused to let go. They were clearly in tremendous pain and tremendously fatigued. God, why didn't they let go? As Jeffords and I watched in horrified silence, the Piper removed one hand from his pipe, though he continued to play, deftly manipulating his instrument with only 5 fingers. His other hand reached into one of the many pockets of his coat. As he drew the hand out, we could make out something pink and gray, squirming in his hand. I squinted at the computer screen we were watching the footage on, and made the dreadful realization that he was holding a rat. The rat looked well fed. It was large and muscular. However, the mangy fur hinted at some kind of disease. The Piper lifted the rodent by the tail as it clawed and twisted in the air, gnashing its jagged teeth. It looked mad with aggression, almost rabid. He suddenly tossed it backwards behind himself and the kids. It hit the ground on all 4s and scampered into the shadows. He then reached into a different pocket, retrieving a second rat and performing the same chilling ritual as he had with the first. As I looked closer, I could just about make out the way the cloth of his coat was wriggling. How many did he have in there? My brain suddenly noticed something. There were more rats, a little way behind the procession, staying just within the shadows but always following. They leapt and crawled over the trash and obstacles in their way, moving in small groups of 3s or 4s, tenaciously following behind. Eventually the eerie figure of the Piper and the poor children moved out of shot, but for at least 10 minutes, the exodus of rats continued. Every so often the small forms would dart along the alley, always following. The entire investigation team was utterly aghast. Whatever we were dealing with here, it was something far, far worse than we had first anticipated. We didn't tell the press or the public about the development in the case. This was just strictly confidential. I felt confusion, and I felt helplessness, and I felt fear. Fear for the kids trapped with that thing, and a deeper fear. Fear because I was beginning to realize that there are beings out there beyond what human minds are able or willing to understand. Now the trail began to go cold. We had no more witness sightings, and with a search area now so large, there was little we could do. I couldn't order car checks. The Piper moved on foot. I tried offering a monetary reward. I tried helicopter searches. Nothing. I tried sniffer dogs. Still, nothing. I felt utterly unable to do anything to help the missing children, and I felt solely responsible for whatever horror was being inflicted on them. The worst moment was facing the parents, telling them that I had been wrong, that their little ones weren't going to come home. Soon, it had been a month. Then 2. The case was essentially dead. My colleagues stopped working on it. My superiors gave us new assignments. But I couldn't concentrate on any new cases. My mind was replaying the footage over and over again. My dreams were taken up with nightmarish visions of that horrible, spine-chilling mask. Then, 3 months later, I was on a visit to a different precinct, picking up some samples from their forensic lab. I overheard one of their officers talking about how, way upstate, the cops were getting flooded by reports of a massive freak rat migration. How, in one town, people were stuck in their homes as the streets were flooded with the rodents. My mind instantly began to whir. Of course, it was an absolute shot in the dark, but the Piper had been heading upstate, and it was completely the wrong time of year for that kind of behavior from the animals. Those kinds of migrations actually happen more than you'd think in some farm communities, but only in the late summer. One explanation I could think of was that they were being attracted to something, just like the rats in that alley. At that point in time, I was willing to do just about anything to find those kids, to bring some kind of closure. I asked the officers what town they meant. I'm not going to tell you its name, but it was a small rural community out in the backwoods, surrounded by farmland. I did my own research and found that the town was a day's drive away. I didn't tell my superiors about this development. There was no way they were going to authorize me to investigate such a tenuous lead. The only person I could find it in was Jeffords. He was just as invested as me. He agreed to come up with me. By the time we got around to going, the migration had been over a month. But that didn't matter. I was sure that we would find something. From research and speaking to the locals, we discovered that the majority of the rats had been seen moving in the direction of an abandoned farm a half-mile away. We arrived at the farm, and were instantly hit by the eerie atmosphere. The sight of the big, decrepit windmill looming ahead made me shiver, and we noticed the rats immediately too. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, and as soon as we got out of our car, the rodents swarmed around our feet. They appeared from hay bales and shrubbery, and skittered away again just as fast under our boot heels. We made our way to the old farmhouse first, and went from room to room, checking for anything. Here the rats were even more populous, filling up corridors and diving out of rotting pantry shelves. We found nothing in the house, though we tore it apart, searching under beds and in cupboards. Next, we trudged up to the big barn at the top of the hill. Looking up as we approached, I felt an unshakable sense of dread. The barn had been a true agricultural leviathan. When it had been functioning, it must have been able to store more grain than could ever be needed. The red and white paint was peeling off now, and there was a large hole in the roof where the timbers had collapsed. Jeffords and I heaved open the large doors and entered. The smell hit us first. It was absolutely rancid, a mixture of shit and death. The interior was pitch black. We could literally see nothing inside. Turning on our torches, we cautiously made our way past the stacks of molding hay, which were piled on top of each other all the way up to the roof. The ground was obscured by layers of thick, muddy straw, which in turn was caked with rodent feces. The only light that was provided by our torches in the weak moonlight shining through the hole in the roof. The rats were all around us, constantly brushing up against our legs, scuttling past. When I pointed my flashlight at the stacks of hay, I could see it writhing and shifting, as if it was alive. Each bale must have been absolutely packed with the things. Every so often one would leap out from the hay. The rats made me uneasy. They never quite plucked up the courage to attack us, but they had screeched and bared their teeth whenever we passed them. When I pointed my torch far into the distance of the path ahead of us, I could see thousands of yellow eyes staring from the shadows watching us, chittering. It was one of the most eerie sights I've ever had the displeasure of seeing. I noticed it first, a faint sound coming from the end of the barn. As we got closer, hearts pounding, my ears could make out to be that same damn tune. Greensleeves. Except this time, it was slightly different. It wasn't being played on a wooden pipe. It had a different kind of tinkle, almost like a piano, but not quite. Now Jeffords and I were both extremely on edge, expecting any moment to see that horrific, smiling face peeking out from the shadows. Eventually we drew towards the end of the barn, but the back wall came up too quickly. From the outside, the barn should have been gone on for a few more minutes. Then we saw the door. In the center of the back wall was a rusty metal door. It was thick steel. It looked like it had been taken from an industrial site. There were deep scratches and dents in the surface, and rust stained it all over. As I drew closer to the door, I began to feel an unexplainable fear. I wanted to turn away from that wretched place and never come back. I did not want to see what lay beyond that door. I knew somehow that whatever its contents was, it would be awful. We found the source of the noise sitting just in front of the door, an old battered music box. I couldn't find any kind of switch or lever to turn it off, so we let it continue to play its hypnotic tune. It acted almost as a background theme as we continued. The door, strangely, was not locked. We pulled the handle down and, with some effort, it creaked open. Instantly the smell hit us. It was 100 times worse than when we had first entered the barn. Jeffords turned and vomited on the floor. I knew in the pit of my stomach that we were going to find in there. I'm going to describe what was behind the door as best I can, in such a way that is still respectful to the deceased. I don't want to go into graphic detail, especially not in this kind of case, but I have to. I must. I need to get across the horror. If I come across as apathetic in my retelling of it, that is because I have wept for so long that I am numb now. There was a room behind the door. Somebody had put up a fake back wall in order to conceal its presence. The room was small but not cramped. There was a table set up in the center with 5 chairs around it. The walls, floor, and furniture of the room were smeared with rat shit like the rest of the barn, but in an even higher concentration. There were thick chains connected to the walls which ran all the way to each chair. Each chair had 2 chains, each with a manacle on the end, presumably to shackle the feet. In the center of the table, there was a pot of crayons and colored pencils. And there were some stacks upon stacks of paper drawings, children's drawings, of houses and stick figures and pirate ships and random scribbles. God knows how long that monster kept those poor kids in there. Every drawing was soaked with blood. There was also blood spattered on the table, chairs, walls, and floor. It was long dried and crusted. This is more difficult than you can imagine for me to write. We didn't find a single whole body in there, only bits and pieces. A few gnawed limbs, appendages, and torsos scattered all over the room. Every body part we found was covered in bite marks, almost stripped to the bone in some places. Tiny little gouges made by tiny little teeth. The piper had kept those children in there. He had attracted the waves of rats. He had chained them up so they didn't have a chance. And he had left the rats to devour them. It has taken me a few tries to type this. Can't stop myself from gagging. We found that goddamn fucking mask lying in the middle of the floor, amidst the blood and the shit. It stared up at us, grinning, mocking, laughing. You couldn't save them, it giggled. We left the barn in a daze. I stomped on the music box, crushing it beneath my boot. We called for backup and it soon arrived. Already Jeffords and I had decided to just tell the parents we had found the bodies. Nothing more, no details. Over the next few weeks, our team found more in the room. A few teeth, bones, strands of hair, fingers. DNA tests confirmed them to belong to the 5 missing children. All 5 accounted for. On the chairs, they found traces of human urine and feces, confirming our fears. The children had suffered for a long time. In one corner, they found the handkerchiefs. We tested them. They were covered in super glue. Scraps of skin and torn flesh where small hands had been ripped away. The piper wasn't an eldritch being. He didn't lure the kids to follow him through mystical means. He was just a sick, twisted, depraved monster of a man. Wasn't he? You see, ever since that day in the barn, I haven't been able to get the Greensleeves tune out of my head. Even after a year, I find myself humming it, no matter how much it revolts me. Even when I'm able to force myself to stop, it continues to play at the back of my mind. But nowadays, when it's late at night and I'm alone, either in my room or working a night shift in my new accounting job, I hear it. Clearly now, as if something is playing it on a wooden pipe just outside. And I want to listen. I want to go outside. I want to. Sorry, I've just had to stop my foot from tapping to the rhythm. I want to follow the music. Off into the dark. I think about life, how it all starts, how it ends. We come into this world screaming and kicking, fighting for that first breath. We are so small, so defenseless. Yet mere seconds after we emerge into the world, we are thrust into a battle that we will lose. Some begin to battle strong, fiercely challenging death, and others begin with death already at their door, fighting not just for their first breath, but for each one that follows. I was born a cripple with a twisted spine and half-formed lungs. I should have died shortly after entering this dark world. The midwife had given me no more than 2 days to live, and told my parents to cherish the little time they would have with me. Yet when 2 days came to pass, I still fought. Death would not claim me. I would not let it. So I battled with it like a lion. My father wanted to take me out into the woods and leave me to the beasts. My mother would not let him. Day in and day out, she sat there with me and she prayed as I waged my war to live. 2 days turned into 2 months, and 2 months became 2 years. I grew stronger, breathing deeper, and my spine grew straighter. Yet, I was still weak, and this displeased my father greatly. All the village warriors were blessed with strong, healthy children who would someday take up arms and carry on the legacies of their fathers. My father was cursed with a cripple whose every breath was uncertain, a child who couldn't carry his own weight, much less the honor of the generations before. By the time I was 10, I was able to walk on my own, but still unable to run. I had no friends and spent most of my time reading books. "You will never be able to swing a sword," my mother would say. "But your mind is sharper than any blade, and you will use it to conquer nations." My mother was the horn that urged me on in battle. She would not let me give up. I could not quit. The children taunted me in the streets, and their fathers would laugh as I limped, my twisted form causing me to put forth great effort with each step. My own father had scarcely said more than 10 words to me in my entire life. My mother, however, was always there to catch me when my weak legs trembled and I fell, her gentle hands always there to wipe away my tears. By 15, I was still the weakest amongst all the village children. Yet, I bore a strength within that none of them could ever grasp. I had dueled with the cold claws of death more times than the most seasoned of warriors. I had stopped breathing more times than I could count, had fallen sick so often that I could count the days. I had been healthy on one hand, and yet I fought on. My mother often worried at the hard look in my eyes, and my father no longer failed to meet my eyes out of disgust, but rather out of fear. I was a monster, often lashing out with cruel words to the healers, or coming up with wicked plans to gain revenge on those who had taunted me in the streets. The children no longer taunted me. Their fathers no longer laughed at me. They all knew that I was weak, but I was also capable of doing horrible things to those who wronged me. When the Black Death came, the people placed the blame upon my shoulders, and they cursed my parents. "You let that demon live among us, and now God is punishing us." Maybe they were right. Maybe my existence was an abomination. Maybe my very breaths were likened to blasphemy. My whole village would fall victim to the sickness. I myself was not spared. It's a horrid thing watching someone die of the plague. It would begin with a fever. The patient would get cold sweats and become extremely weak. Within hours, the tumors would appear. The death sentence. Once the tumors appeared, there was no surviving, and soon black spots would begin to form all over the afflicted. After this, death came swiftly. It is one thing to watch the sickness take someone else, but to watch it work its way through you is something entirely different. When it first came on, my mother prayed that it was simple, one of my normal bouts of sickness. But when the tumors formed, all our hope vanished. The pain was unbearable, and the fear was even worse. I had survived 16 years of the most miserable afflictions known to man, and I was simply going to die. This would be how death took me. I could do nothing. I was even more helpless now than I was as a newborn baby. Soon after I fell ill, my mother and father caught the plague as well. My father, the big, strong warrior, was gone within the day. I was brought in to die next to my mother on the 3rd day. I could scarcely recognize her. Her eyes were sunken into her skull and bulbous tumors disfigured her. But still within those cavernous sockets, I saw the loving eyes of my mother. She had been my strength, and now here she was with hardly enough strength to open her eyes. It's time to go home, Con. Her voice was weak, almost a whisper. You have to keep fighting. Death hasn't claimed you yet. Don't let it. With that, my mother let out her final breath, sighing softly. A final trumpet blast urging me on to my final battle with mortality. They had brought me here to be with my mother as I died, yet it was she who had passed, and now, for the first time in my life, I was truly alone. I bared my teeth, and through my tears I looked out at the dark window into the night. With all the strength I had left in my dying body, I screamed a challenge into the darkness. I will not let you take me. My head collapsed back onto the mattress behind me, and I softly whispered, I won't let you have me. I think it was then that death decided that it didn't want me. I fell into a deep sleep, and though I had finally lost in my battle for life, but I was awakened by the sounds of birds. When I opened my eyes, light shone all around me. I was in a meadow that I recognized well. I had spent many hours laying here in the grass, daydreaming about being strong, going on raids with my father and becoming a great warrior. Now, however, everything was different. I was no longer in pain, and when I breathed in, it felt as though wind filled my lungs. I felt stronger, and when I went to stand, it was easy. I had strength in my legs and was able to stand up tall. I laughed as I ran back and forth in the meadow. I thought surely I had died and this was heaven. Maybe dying wasn't so bad after all. I ran back to the village, hoping to find it full of all those who had perished, hoping to find my mother. When I arrived, however, my eyes were greeted by a different sight. My village was reduced to ashes, and plague signs stood on each road entering the town. It was not hard to figure out that the town had been burned to stop the spread of the sickness. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I ran to where my house was, hoping to find something still standing, but I was greeted by nothing more than burnt timbers. I slowly walked where my room had once been, and I wept. I did not know how I had suddenly grown strong, or how I had overcome the sickness, but none of that mattered to me now, because now I was alone. I no longer knew anyone, and though I had been hated, that was better than this soul-crushing loneliness that I now felt. After sitting in the ashes for what must have been hours, I stood to my feet and wiped my eyes. A small movement in the wind caught my eye, and I moved closer to inspect it. Nailed to the only beam left standing in my house was a paper with letters scrawled across it in scarlet ink. It read, "If you so dearly want life, then I want no part of you." Signed, Death. I stared at the paper incredulously for a while, and then I turned and wandered aimlessly. I wandered for years, living off the land. Several times I met the sharp end of a bandit's dagger, or felt the teeth of wolves, but each time I awoke again. I continued to age until I turned 20, and from then on nothing changed. The years passed by and the world changed around me, but I always remained the same. I lived many lifetimes and had many names. Sometimes I was a simple farmer, and sometimes a great scholar. I became a great swordsman and fought in many wars. Over the years I accumulated great amounts of wealth and influence. Yet I still felt a deep ache in my heart because I was alone. Soon life became boring and painful, so I began seeking out ways to die. Poison didn't work, it just made me mildly sick. And when I fell on my sword, I would simply reawaken in my library, the place in which I found the most joy. I tried every possible way I could think of to end my life. I joined armies and went on death missions. I incited riots, stole from nobles, and even sank ships I was on. hoping that I would find a permanent solution to the ache in my heart. Centuries passed and I could not end it, so I chose to simply try to live as normal of a life as possibly could. I came to the Americans on a boat in 1851 and bought a small piece of land in the South where I grew crops and hoped to live peacefully. My peace didn't last long, and when the Civil War hit, I was driven from my land by the devastation of battle. I fled the South and went to Kansas, and it was there that I was able to make a home for myself and settle down. I was able to live peacefully through both world wars and evaded the draft in Vietnam, but life, I have learned, is much crueler than death. I moved up into Nebraska in 1996 after the residents of my Kansas home discovered that I was the same person that had been living there for over a century. Nebraska, much like Kansas, was a forgotten state, and I knew that I could avoid notice out on the plains. I spent many years on the plains, however. I grew bored and decided that it was worth the risk to move to the city. In 2015, I moved to Lincoln and got a job working at a gas station. It wasn't the best job, but it was low-key, and that's where I met Violet. It pains me to say it, but I hadn't loved anyone since my mother died. Other people seemed like ants to me. They were barely noticeable. One moment they were there, and the next, they were gone. I had lived for over 6 centuries and learned very quickly not to draw close to anyone, because they would die and I would live on. At first I saw myself as superior, then I looked at others with envy, but that too disappeared and was replaced by an emptiness, that is, until I met Violet. It was raining that night, and the gas station hadn't had any customers. I was sitting at the counter reading a new novel and wondering how anyone could think that it was real literature, when I heard the bell ring as the door opened. I looked up to see a short young woman with long brunette hair pulling down her hood as she looked around. I inwardly groaned, annoyed that I would have to clean up the water that she had just tracked in. Then her eyes met mine, and my heart stopped. She wasn't the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. There was, honestly, nothing truly remarkable about her. But there was something in her eyes that made my cheeks flush, and I couldn't look away. "Can I help you, dude?" she asked, sounding kind of annoyed. Sorry, you're just, the first customer I've had in a few hours." She grinned as I tripped over my words. "My car broke down a little way back. Is the mechanic in?" She gestured towards the auto shop sign flickering outside. "I'm sorry, but he won't be in until tomorrow. I can leave you a note if you'd like." She let out a sigh of defeat and plopped at one of the chairs by the coffee machine. "Is it alright if I sleep here tonight then?" I looked at her curiously. We're about to close and I can't just leave you here." She rolled her eyes and pointed outside at the gas station sign. "Dude, it literally says open 24 hours. I sighed. "Yeah, it hasn't been open for a full 24 hours for a couple years. Pete, the owner, can't afford to pay us all day. If you need a ride home, though, I can give you one." She shook her head and said, "Home is on the other side of the state. That's why I wanted to stay here." I shrugged apologetically and told her I wasn't sure what to tell her. She simply turned around and walked out the door saying, "I'll find somewhere else." I shook my head thinking that was weird and began to start closing the station. As I was mopping up the mess she made on the floor, I looked outside and felt bad for just sending her out into the rain. There was nothing I could do now, but I didn't feel any better about it. I finished closing the store and got in my car. The roads that night were slick with rain, so I drove slowly, and it took me longer than usual to get home. As I was driving, I saw a figure hunched over the side of the road and pulled over. I rolled down my window and shouted, "You okay?" The figure lifted their head and my eyes met those of the gas station girl. Once again, It felt like electricity was coursing through my veins. Do I look okay, man? In case you haven't noticed, it's kind of raining out here. I wasn't sure what to do, so I just said, do you want to stay at my place for the night? I've got a couch you could sleep on. I expected her to say no, but she just looked at me and said, no creepy shit, bro. And she quickly opened my door and sat down in the passenger seat. The first few minutes of the drive were spent in silence until I spoke up. I'm Connor, by the way. She pulled back her hood and looked at me with those strange eyes. My name's Violet. Nice to meet you, bro. It had been a long time since I'd had to have a genuine interaction with another person, so I just awkwardly sat there in silence for a few minutes. So, what do you do for a living? She smiled and said, I don't really have a steady job. I've been trying to write a book for years, but I never could finish a story. I chuckled and said, I understand that. I'm having a hard time finding a good ending for my own story. Her eyes lit up. You're writing a story? What's it about? I looked out the driver's side window. I guess you could say it's a tragic story. She seemed to note the change in my mood and just nodded. When we arrived at my house and hurried inside and I flicked my light on, Violet gasped, how does a gas station attendant afford a home like this? My house wasn't necessarily a mansion, but it was large and well furnished. I just inherited some money. She looked at me incredulously and said, and you are making me sleep on the couch? Don't you have guest rooms? I grinned sheepishly. They're all kind of full of books. We walked into the living room and she just stood there in wide-eyed amazement at the sheer amount of books I had lining the walls. Why do you have so many books? There's no way you could read all of these, even if you had a lifetime. I ignored her and went upstairs to grab a spare pillow and blanket. When I came down, she was holding a copy of Don Quixote. Dude, this is awesome. Where did you get all these books? I handed her the blanket and said, when I was little, my mother told me that with our minds we could conquer nations. So I've just been collecting books ever since then. She looked at me thoughtfully and said, your mother sounds like a very smart woman. I smiled slightly. She was. If you want anything, I have some food in the fridge. Help yourself. Plates and glasses are in the cupboard above the sink. With that, I wished her a good night and headed up to my bedroom. I changed into shorts and a t-shirt and laid down in my bed. But try as I might, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to those green eyes of Violet's. What was so special about her? Around 1 a.m, I finally fell asleep, but I was awakened several hours later by the sound of banging coming from the kitchen. I got up, put on my jeans and a hoodie, and walked downstairs to see what was going on. The smell of scrambled eggs permeated the air and my stomach began to grumble. I walked into the kitchen and saw Violet reading Don Quixote while she sipped at some coffee and ate from a full plate of eggs. You said to help myself. She smirked. I was thinking about making you some, then I remembered that you kicked me out of the gas station. I sighed and grabbed an apple off the counter. I'll drive you to the gas station today, and we'll see about getting your car fixed. She waved a hand at me. Already taken care of. I called and some guy named Jerry towed it to the shop already. He said he'd call back when he figured out what was up with it. As if on cue, Violet's phone rang and she picked up. From the tone of her voice, it sounded like Jerry had bad news. After about 5 minutes of heated discussion, she hung up and glared at me. Looks like I won't have to steal this book, she said, holding up the copy of Don Quixote. The mechanic said it's going to be at least a week before it's repaired. Then he proceeded to tell me that I shouldn't drive if this is the kind of damage I do to cars. My eyes went wide and I said, so what are you going to do in that week? She scratched her head thoughtfully. I'll start by finishing this book. Then I'll drink all your coffee, and maybe I'll start writing my own book." She nodded like she thought that was a great idea, then sat back in her chair and started reading like nothing had happened. Violet wouldn't leave that week, or the next week for that matter. For the first time in 6 centuries, I felt love in my heart. Somehow my icy heart thawed, and though I was ancient, I felt young once more. My simple words are inadequate in describing her, and for that I apologize. Violet was wise beyond her years, and she bore the most compassionate heart I had ever seen. She was always willing to stop in order to help someone in need. She certainly helped me. I often found her changing my perspectives or offering up wisdom that changed the course of my life. I was worried about telling her who I was, and that constantly stressed me out because as she aged, I never would, and the truth would come out one way or another. One day I finally worked up the courage to talk to her about it, and that memory is forever etched into my mind. It was a nice day. The sun was shining brightly, and we had just gone to dinner. As we were driving home, I reached over and took her hand before saying, "I need to talk to you about something, babe." She looked at me with a concerned look. "What's wrong?" My heart beat faster than I thought possible. I was terrified that I would lose the one person that mattered to me. I told her everything, from the beginning to the end, hoping beyond all hope that she wouldn't think I was insane. When I finished, she wiped the tears from her eyes and said, "I don't care if you outlive me. Just promise me one thing." I squeezed her hand. "Anything." A loving smile crept up on her face and she said, "Promise me that you'll love me as long as you live." A week later, I proposed to her, and we were married 2 months later. She wanted it to be simple. We didn't invite many people. She invited her parents, and I had no one to invite. We were married in my library. She said that was where she fell in love with me. I told her I fell in love with her the moment I saw her, and she said, "Well, we aren't getting married in a gas station." I had 5 days with her, and then the unthinkable happened. Like I said, life is much more cruel than death. One morning as we were sitting at the table, Violet stood up to make coffee and found the coffee can empty. I didn't necessarily need coffee, but I came to learn that coffee was all she drank. I had to go to work, so I told her I would bring home some coffee. But she decided that she needed it then and there, so we walked to the cars together. Before we went our separate ways, I leaned in and gave her a kiss, taking in her beauty and staring into those caring eyes. She was my world. I had barely gotten to work when I received the call. I fell to my knees as the voice on the other end told me that my whole world had come crashing down. Violet had been driving to the store to buy coffee when she was T-boned. She wasn't paying attention and ran a red light, resulting in the accident that would take her from me. I was told that she died on the scene, and my heart broke. I didn't even get the chance to tell her goodbye. She was there one moment and gone the next. My whole world gone in an instant. Violet's funeral was beautiful. I made sure that she was laid to rest with everything that she loved. It sounds strange, I know, but I had to give her something. In her coffin, I placed her favorite book, Don Quixote. I knew she would have liked that. People from all around showed up to the funeral. People she had helped, friends, and her family. Her father gave me a big hug and said, "She loved you, son." After her death, I tried to end it again and again. It never worked. No matter how many times I tried to do it, I would wake up at her grave. I turned to alcohol to ease the pain. I was broken and had no hope. I'd only ever had 2 people in my life that truly cared about me, and they were both gone, ripped away from me, and I bore the curse of life so I could never see them again. It's been a year since she died, and the pain hasn't gone away. It hasn't ebbed at all. I lost my job because of my drinking, and I've been unable to find a new one. I can't pay the utilities on my house, and I have to go to the homeless shelter to get food and water. Life is no longer worth living, yet I must go on living. I had lost all hope. Until 2 months ago. I received a package in the mail. It was raining, and I didn't hear the mail truck drive up, but I heard a knock at my door. I pulled myself off the floor and took a long pull off the whiskey bottle in my hand. When I opened the door, there was no one there, but on the ground there was a small rectangular parcel wrapped in white cloth. I picked it up and walked to the kitchen counter, where I unwrapped the package. Inside was a book, the very same one I had buried with the woman I had loved. I ran my hand over the hardcover and tears welled up in my eyes. I didn't understand what kind of sick joke this was. Who would do this to me? I opened the book, and on the first page there were words written in scarlet ink. My mind took me back to the paper that I had found in the ruins of my home 600 years ago. It was the same handwriting, but this time it said, "Death is a raven. It flies overhead, taking the brave and the craven, and claiming all the dead. Look, you fool," the raven cries. "Can't you see the gift that you've been given? Another good person dies, and you just go on living." Violet. I looked at the paper in shock, and tears welled within my eyes. I could see my folly. I had been given a gift, and I wasted it. In my long life, I had served only myself, but Violet had shown me how to be selfless. I had wallowed in my own self-pity for hundreds of years and not taken notice of the gift that was given to me. A lot has happened in the 2 months since I received the package. I will make it short for your sake. I am dying. It seems that my body is finally failing me after all this time. Usually I heal quickly, but the doctors say that the cancer is spreading faster than anything they've ever seen. I sold my house and donated the profits to the homeless shelter. I donated all of my books to the library. Hopefully they will find some use there. I kept one book, though. I couldn't part with it. I feel like I have done so little to help the world, and that is my greatest regret. This is my letter to the world. When I was young and weak, my mother's love showed me how to be strong. It showed me how to not quit, how to never let anything stop me. It gave me strength, yet when my mother died, none of that strength could help me, and my heart filled with ice, and even death could not thaw it. Yet when I was old and had seen the changing of the world many times, Violet taught me to be vulnerable, to be caring. It was love that made me strong, and in the end, it was love that made me weak. I see them both now, Violet and my mother. They both beckon me home. I apologize for cutting this so short, but the door stands open, and I must walk through before it closes. Everything I'm about to tell you had taken place over a short period of time last year. Another hurricane had just finished battering southern Louisiana, and they needed contractors to fix houses as soon as possible. The amount of homes that were damaged, they needed more inspectors, so they outsourced. That's how I got here. They flew us there, trained us, and we started inspecting houses within a week. Suburban neighborhoods and townhouses had been damaged and destroyed en masse, and they needed us to figure out which houses were the highest priority and which families needed shelter. Basically, triage for buildings and the people who lived in them. During this time, my employers took note of my work ethic, or maybe my skill, something of that sort, and paired me with another sign-on, Andrew. Andrew and I took care of some of the rural houses that had gotten hit, spending a few days together, driving around the outskirts of the city before we finally got the call. Our mutual supervisor called to pull us off the job immediately, taking us off the scheduled route and telling us to head back into town. He didn't bother telling us why, only that it wasn't something which could wait. A small number of important-looking individuals in EPA raincoats and a few other legal-looking men in suits waited for us in a large fly tent staked into a parking lot. Beside them was a large table full of organized folders and documents. Across was our supervisor. This them? One of the EPA gentlemen said. Yes, this is Andrew and Dylan. They're going to be checking it out, our supervisor replied, and already the suits began to funnel out of the tent. Good, hopefully it's nothing. Get it sorted, the EPA officer said, before turning to follow the rest out. With the three of us alone, our supervisor wasted no time and quickly began afflicting us with his anxiety over the situation. Listen, the old man said. I picked you two out for this job because you are the only sign-ons competent enough to get it done. Andrew and I stood in silence as the situation was explained. Some warehouse that was marked as a possible illegal dumping storage site was caught up in the storm. Badly. It's near the shore and the law can't investigate it yet. But someone needs to get out there and make sure a chemical leak isn't about to flood the Gulf and the aquifer. He stopped a moment, backing away and glancing over the paperwork. They think the owner was a shell company who they couldn't get a hold of. Hightailed it out of town before the storm hit. No one should be left there to bother you while you investigate. What exactly are we looking for? Andrew asked after a brief moment of silence. Any visible evidence of chemical spills, leaks, or containers of any kind. I want no pictures. Only an account from the two of you, understood? I responded with a, yes, sir. As Andrew nodded, after further explanation and directions, we were back in the truck driving towards the supposed site. The sun was at its worst by the time we got near. The few stray rain clouds did little to blot out the blinding orange sun of late summer evening. Rays of the harsh light pouring through the cypress trees and elms that began to surround us. As we made our way further into the marsh, as the drive went on and the sun fell further, the world around us began to feel a little more desolate. Debris and abandoned cars still littered the roads and fields from the hurricane. Shops and homes were left to rot with smashed windows and torn roofs. The distant shoreline signaled we'd gotten close to our destination, but as the sun fell behind the trees and horizon, the sea darkened, blending into the night sky, our headlights soon becoming the only source of light around us. No shops, no street lamps, no stoplights, only the thick air, heavy with the scent of a freshly upturned swamp. After the long trek, the GPS finally said we'd arrived. It was a gas station our supervisor told us would be the closest spot on a map to drive to. From there, the directions were handwritten, into the marsh about a mile in. Andrew and I sat in the truck preparing with only the timid lights of the truck's dash and radio. The thin crescent moon hiding behind the cypress jungle that surrounded us. You ready? He asked me, looking out into the darkness, backpack over his lap. Should have asked me that 3 hours ago, I said, stuffing my gear back into a small pack. Yeah, same here. God damn, it's hot out here, Andrew said as he opened the driver's side door. As our doors opened, the previously muted sounds of the swamp flooded us. An orchestra of amphibians and insects, over waves breaking against the near shore. Marshy grass squelched beneath our boots as we trekked through the flooded field, our flashlights barely able to break through the sultry air. Wasn't even this muggy up north. No wonder no one wants to come down here, Andrew said, looking down at his footing. How close do you think we are? I asked, shining the flashlight to the end of the field on its brightest setting. The barest suggestion of a tree line revealing itself in the darkness. He said it was on the other side of this, didn't he? Near the water? The grassy field had led to a large expanse of swampland bordering the ocean inlet. As we reached the field's end, the sounds of the ocean grew. The breeze chilled, and through the darkness and the trees, we could see a strangely rectangular object. There, on the coastline, I said, pointing my flashlight down to reveal the dull shine of sheet metal. That's gotta be it, right? He asked, the two of us stepping over small sinkholes, ferns, stumps, and vines to reach the warehouse-like building. It was obviously a new building. Much of the sheet metal exterior was newly painted, and a very expensive-looking security door was the only opening we could find. It sat nearly halfway into the water. We couldn't get a good look at the water side, but it seemed to be deliberate positioning, not from flooding. Dylan, check this out. I heard from the front of the building. Andrew was inspecting the very large double security door. Some kind of card reader was attached to it, but no handle or lock was visible. Well, how are we going to get inside? I asked, trying to peer through the eye slit. Andrew looked at me with a face of smug disbelief as he pushed gently onto the door. With a heavy metallic creak, it slowly swept open. Unlocked already. I guess it's not breaking and entering if we don't do any breaking. The second door opened with just as much ease, the latch unsecured, giving no resistance. I don't like this place, so let's get this shit over with, Andrew said as he closed the front door behind us, leaving it open just a crack. The smell and sounds of the swamp became faint as we stepped through the hall, replaced with metallic creaking and the billows of wind against the walls and outside trees. The scent of industrial cleaners, solvents, and rotten fish held stagnant in the air. What the hell is that smell? Andrew and I seemed to say in tandem, both of us pulling on our air respirators. It's fishy, but not the normal kind of fishy, right? I asked, Andrew answering with a perplexed stare. Let's just make sure it's not a gas leak or something first. You got the meter on? He asked, holding up his gas sensor. Clicking it on, the device lit a small red LED, which turned green after a few moments. We both looked at each other, implicitly agreeing, and continuing through the hallway. The entrance made way to a small common area. It was windowless. Not even the smallest LED light broke through the pitch dark before our flashlights illuminated what they could. Against the sheet metal walls, we could hear the wind gaining strength outside, masking the faint and familiar sound of heavy raindrops against the metal roof. The two of us inspected the room, an ordinary room that felt strangely out of place. Some kind of reception desk, chairs, folding tables, everything upright and neatly placed, unaffected by storm or apparent retreat of the owners. We searched it quickly before moving on into the closet doorway that Andrew had already entered. Hey, Andrew peered out from the doorway. Take a look at this. Behind the reception desk, another security door, unpowered and unlocked. A small office room stood cramped together, pillars piled on papers, printed photographs, maps, and charts pinned to boards that hung on the sheet metal walls, but no computers. The wet smell of mildew crept in, mixing with the dusty, dry air inside, Taking in air through the mask required effort, like breathing through a straw. Desks stood pressed against the inner wall, and windows looked out into the main warehouse-type area in the center of the building a few feet below. With what light could penetrate the thick, strangely dark glass, I could see two large boat-sized objects side by side, each covered by some sort of tarp. If they're storing anything in this place, I'd say it's down there, I said just loud enough for Andrew to pick up. Those definitely look like containers of some kind, or boats. They could be dumping the stuff right there, he said, squinting at the things for a moment. But before we go down there, look at this stuff. He motioned me towards a collection of papers he'd taken off the boards. Photos, graphs, diagrams. Most were blurry, labeled in ways I couldn't decipher, lacking enough context to understand. However, a few stood out to me. First, there was a photograph of a small beached boat. This stood out to me only because it was labeled "Last known location remains yet to be discovered." Second was some sort of map. It was of the Louisiana coast and the further Gulf of Mexico. Diagrams and grids were drawn across it, mostly centering on the center of the Gulf. Points crossed out here and there, labeled with dates stretching back nearly a year. Sighting, X-band, 15,000 feet, untraceable, was noted next to a large circle. Lastly, there was this colleague of sorts. A collection of headshots from random people, as if they were pulled straight from some social media profiles. Each was labeled with a name and their status. Judy Henderson, female, 27, A9160, status, subject 1, recovered, stage 3 decomposition. Andrew Baker, male, 13, B4196, status, subject 2. Dylan Hall, male, 26, B1420, status, subject 2. This went on to list over a dozen more people. Those labeled subject 1 had more information on them, but for those labeled as subject 2, the information ended there. Piles of paper littered the desks and floor. I tried to read some of them, but the government legal speech was too heavy to break through for either of us. I skimmed for keywords that might hint at chemical dumping, but no sense could be made from any of it. The hairs on my neck stood straight, and I could feel a tingle course through my body. I shivered. Andrew, have you seen this? I turned, paper in hand, as the metal building rung with an ear-deafening crash. The entire room vibrated, and I nearly collapsed from the sudden shock of the ear-bursting explosion. And the familiar sound of thunder above that followed shortly after. Jesus Christ, Andrew said, gripping his ears. A torrent of rain began pouring against the sheet metal roof, echoing throughout the building. We should probably pick up the pace, I said as another sound rung out. Something very large shattered in the room beside us. The haunting sound of distant shattering glass that filled anyone with a sense of immediate panic and dread. Andrew and I said nothing, sharing a short glance before moving towards the side door. Just like the others, this door was unlocked, but was exceptionally heavy. A few steps led into a large room. Concrete foundation and walls this time. Our flashlights scanned the room, quickly centering on a sparkling pile of broken glass and spilled liquid. Something large flying in the midst of it all. Dark, decayed, stretching across the floor. A body. A human body. The smell of formaldehyde choked me through the mask. I think I would have vomited if not for the adrenaline and panic I was experiencing. You're seeing this too, right, Dylan? Andrew said, his flashlight revealing the subtle shake of his hands as it illuminated this thing that looked as if it was exhumed from a grave. I think we need to get the hell out of here. Now, I said, unable to take my eyes off it. Dylan? Andrew said, and I realized his flashlight had moved, illuminating something else. The place where the body had broken free from. There was more of them, contained in large glass pillars, silhouettes floating in a tank of dark yellow liquid. The smell became more unbearable than the sight of it, but before I could leave, I could see something written on one of the tanks. Dylan, we need to leave, Andrew said behind me, but I was going to be quick about it. I stepped forward, leaning in, trying to ignore the chemical-soaked corpse only a few feet away. It was a white label stuck onto the glass reading only A9160, written in marker. Another crash reverberated through the building, shaking the metal structure and anything not pinned down, including myself. This time was different, though. It wasn't thunder. The screeching howl lasted mere seconds, but it echoed, a inhuman call that no machine or billow of wind could produce, and I immediately could tell that it came from the center room, a few feet beside us. I couldn't bring myself to move or to look at Andrew. I was too affixed on trying to lower my heart rate, my chest beating up my throat, echoing through my ears. I tried to take a deep breath, the smell of formaldehyde causing me to almost pass out. Andrew took my shoulder with a hard grip and I snapped back. We left the place quickly and without speaking, opening the heavy, unlocked metal door once again. Only this time it seemed a bit larger and harder to push. The room was far too large. The smell of rotten fish and salt water replaced the chemical odor. My eyes began to burn. We went the wrong way, Andrew said in a whisper, but he was equally compelled to move through the center chamber we'd found ourselves in, instead of backtracking. It doesn't smell like chemicals in here, I thought aloud, shining my light across the room. Across the two large objects sat side by side in the center of it. Closest to me was the smallest covered object, smaller than the hulking silhouette on the other side of the room, but still larger than a rowboat. Andrew was inspecting the far wall, looking for an exit. I carefully made my way through the chamber, the floor crowded with tools, soaked papers, and tattered clothing, until I was close enough to see the fabric lines of the heavy canvas tarp covering this thing, and a small label reading simply, Number 1. It was a smell like a seafood market, not quite rotten, not yet, at least. There was something else there. I could smell it through the respirator, the smell of a freshly butchered fish. I lifted the tarp, peeking underneath. Andrew, get over here, I said, almost melancholic in disbelief. Stop messing with that stuff. We need to... He stopped mid-sentence, seeing the small part of the thing I'd uncovered. I couldn't quite make out what he had said underneath his mask, but it sounded Spanish. I tore the tarp away as best I could, both of us stepping back as if we'd lit the fuse on a stick of dynamite. It lied there, unmoving, distended. I could hardly see any of the dark skin. With all the red there was, it was impossible to tell at first glance which part was the dissected, hollowed-out cavity, and which was the thing's mouth. I cannot express the intangibility of it. It was no beast I'd ever laid eyes on before. In life or fiction, no features familiar to me stood out, besides the possible presence of organs, but none of those sickly, dark, glossy things looked like any organs I'd ever seen. I could tell what had to be its head, but every primal sense within me spoke against that assumption. It was a flabby, almost melted mass of fleshy coils, protruding growths, glossy black beads embedded along the outer layer of its cylindrical head. I could hear something like wind, and it was then that I realized just how quiet it had become. The rain and thunder gone, and not a word from either me nor Andrew. Only the racing of my heart pounding against my eardrums. The louder the wind became, the less it sounded like wind. "Follow me," Andrew said quietly, urgently, inching towards the front door, gripping my shoulder. The wind grew louder and became methodical. It shook the metal, vibrating the tables and tools strewn across the floor. As we came closer to the exit, my mind became clear enough for me to realize something. There was another one of those things in the room. A much, much larger one. And that sound was not the wind. My dim flashlight only caught the slightest glimpse of the tarp caving in on the larger thing. Before expanding again, it was breathing. Time went by faster than my mind's ability to comprehend its passing. The loud metal clanking of the door behind us opening, matching with the deafening chaos that unfolded in the dark chamber ahead. Among the sounds of metal snapping and glass shattering, I could hear the resounding noise of an animal grunting in the darkness. As we pulled ourselves through the exit door, the back of the chamber opened. Large gates to the coast slammed open with overwhelming force. The darkness of the chamber gave way to the inkling of moonlight from outside and the glimmer of the dark waterfront, masked by a silhouette that towered over the opening, dragging itself closer to the edge. The door slammed behind us just as we made it through. The foundation of the entire building shook in the marshy soil, threatening to collapse into itself. The heavy metal doors swung back and forth on their hinges, almost knocking both of us unconscious. We made our way through the final exit, the humidity and buzzing sounds of the swamp finally returning to us. But beyond those noises of nature, beyond the pounding of my heart and the sound of my own breathing, I could hear something behind the structure, something large sinking into the shallows, disappearing into the ocean. What followed after we escaped that place was a sleepless night in a locked car, hidden away in an abandoned gas station. Neither Andrew nor I were capable of driving in that darkness for more than just a few moments. Every sound and creak jolted me. My eyes burned, and the stench of rotten fish and formaldehyde would not escape my senses. I could see only in Andrew's red eyes the desire to forget everything we had seen, and to assume nothing from what we had not. I have never felt time pass slower than on that night. The still, unmoving darkness that surrounded us until the early morning. Once the sun had broken and revealed the cloudless sky, I felt like reality had returned. They came looking for us. Soon after, I'd told our supervisor that something had happened over the phone. Only capable of driving far enough to get some reception. Nothing happened after this. At least, nothing to do with either of us. They sent us home. There was no interrogation, no questions. They didn't even take our phones. Andrew had not spoken a word to me since leaving that place, and thinking back on it, I hadn't spoken to him either. Neither of us spoke to anyone but ourselves in our minds. Only I had said anything. Over the phone, I had said something to our supervisor. Something I don't remember, but it was enough to signal that we needed help. Or maybe I didn't say anything at all. That was all it took. I'm 22, female, an avid nature photographer. I regularly go on hikes into the deep middle of woods and forests to catch the rarest beauties of nature. Anyway, I head out to this location I've been meaning to go to for a while. Some of my photography friends have been there before and got stunning photos of deer, badgers, and various rare birds. I drove as far as I could before the woods started, and parked my car up in a lay-by, grabbed my tent, camera, and supplies and headed into the forest. It was quite misty, but the forecast said it would clear up overnight. I found a badger den about 30 minutes of walking into the forest, so decided this would be the perfect spot to set up my camera to hopefully catch some badgers on film overnight. I pitched my tent just far enough away not to disturb or scare the badgers, and went over to set up my camera. I had it facing so it would catch lots of the entrances in the same shot, plugged it into the power back, and left it running. I had a motion sensor, so if it was to catch movement overnight, it would begin filming. Everything seemed fine. I was in the middle of the woods, away from any paths, so it was very unlikely anyone would disturb me in the night. The next morning I woke up and could see fresh trails around the den, so I knew I would have caught some badgers on camera. I was so excited. I tried to check the footage on my camera straight away, but both it and the power back had died. And unusually the power pack was no longer plugged into my camera. Weird. I was sure I had plugged it in. I just hoped it had enough battery to catch the badgers on film. I'd have been gutted if I'd missed them. Nervous I'd messed up, I decided to head back to my car to charge up my camera and have a look at the pictures. I packed up everything and walked back to the car. It took about half an hour for my camera to charge up and turn back on. It turns on and I go to my camera roll. The first video was of the badger den, but I couldn't see anything there. There must have been some movement to trigger the camera to begin recording, but I couldn't see anything within the shot. It was recorded at 2:30 a.m. After about 20 seconds of nothing, the recording stops. I flick to the next recording and it's a photo of my tent. I flick to the next and it's a photo of me alone, asleep, inside my tent. This was followed by about 40 more photos of me sleeping in my tent. The final photo, taken at 5:30 a.m., about half an hour before I woke up, was a picture of my car. I could feel the fear rush over me. My hair stood up on the back of my neck. I began driving and I drove as fast as I could. There was no signal and no one else around for miles. I managed to get home safely. I still don't know who took the photos or why they were taken. I've not been camping since. I've always been fascinated by entropy, the concept that things are irreversible and chaos increases over time. That is just something natural, something that happens in the universe. It's a law. Before I go into what has happened, maybe I should spend a little bit talking about myself. That way you might understand my actions better. I'm a quiet and passive person. I speak when spoken to. I don't drink, and I don't smoke. I have a job and I do it well, but it's nothing out of the ordinary, just an office job. So you understand when I say I'm not someone that would attract much attention in a crowd or speak up in class when I had a doubt. As it sometimes happens to people like me, I turned inwards and started developing lonely hobbies. Every new hobby, a new addiction. I jumped around quite a bit. I spent some time drawing, but I could not advance at all. Then I tried photography, but my sense of framing is terrible, and honestly, I'm not much of an artist. Then it was woodworking, and that was almost cost me a finger and most surely a couple €100. The tools still lay around somewhere in the basement because I never had the energy to sell or give those away. I'm trying writing now, so excuse me if my prose has low quality. I write these letters frantically because I can still feel the dust in my skin. I write because I need to move on from my last hobby. observing. Maybe this way things can go back to normal. I call it a hobby for simplicity's sake, but it was more a change in my lifestyle. I discovered occultism. I used to go to a church as a kid and I found it amusing. Although I never judged myself a devoted person, what attracts me are things that are unseen to naked eyes. The outside world doesn't interest me, so when this new door unlocked, I became quite hooked. I started with the basics, the Kabbalion and the Hermetic principles. Then I began devouring books one after the other. I learned the Kabbalah, chaos magic, Thelema, everything. A basic pillar of all these traditions is the meditation, and I picked up on that new activity quite early. As for now, I can sit for more than a full day in meditation. This was the reason of my downfall. I became trapped. In chaos magic, it's stated that the best system of magic is the one you create yourself for yourself. So I decided I would reformulate meditation, the very base of every system. It was bound to work. I stopped calling it meditation and renamed it observation. The changes were quite simple and, as I found out later, not original at all. Instead of closing my eyes and freeing my mind, I would go somewhere and observe. Simply observe. The receptacles of my observation would vary. I started with things at home, some sigil I had traced, a picture of somewhere, or even some action figure. Then I started going to parks. I would find somewhere quiet, preferably deserted, and sit in observation. I would focus my attention in one thing and let it guide me. I've observed plants, ants, animals. I've seen flowers bloom, leaves open up, but that didn't hold me for long. I don't have the most cheerful personality, so things started changing. Life didn't interest me anymore. I became interested in death and corruption. I started watching things rot, mold grow, entropy doing its thing, taking things away, the irreversible path of decay. One day I took a new way to work through a more deserted neighborhood, full of abandoned houses and falling structures. My practices were starting to affect my daily life. When you practice esotericism, for a while your intuition becomes powerful. You're able to feel things. It's not something you perceive rationally, but comes from the subconscious and are not easily explained. You simply know. Passing through this forsaken part of town, a specific building caught my attention. An unfinished construction full of bushes, broken windows, and fallen walls. Some kind of warehouse. Not somewhere that would make a big impact normally, and could even be repulsive. Before the rest of that day, I could not think of anything else. I had a feeling something was waiting for me there. On my way back, it was already dark. I really should have waited for the weekend or something. Planned my observation properly, but I couldn't hold myself. I stopped immediately there after work. As entering the place, I felt a chill running through my spine. It was completely dark, so I turned on my phone's lantern. When I looked around, I saw the most incredible work of entropy. Things were in apparent good shape. There were machines, wood planks, metal pipes, everything apparently new. Apart from this thick layer of gray dust, I found myself a good place to sit, entered the lotus position, turned off the light, and began my observation. At first, it was hard, but then my eyes accustomed themselves with the lack of light, and the shadows started to dance around in inebriating movements. I felt myself leave my body, my eyes fixed on the stack of abandoned machinery and wood. It was then that I had lost track of time. I saw the dust start to accumulate even thicker around me. In the few moments of conscious thoughts, I could not believe what I was seeing. The wood started to rot, the metal started to oxidate, nature started to reclaim its space. I saw people, lost souls walking around, specters from the future, things there were yet to be. Everything decayed, including myself. The dust that gathered around the building also stuck to me. I felt myself become part of the surrounding, just one more forgotten piece left to be reclaimed by time. Entropy reached me. Slowly but constantly I became inoperative, irrecoverable, neglected. I felt a kind of pressure in my chest that could only mean the fear in my heart, but I didn't sense it as I should. Not as I normally do, anyway. It was as if my consciousness was far away from my feelings, as if my mind had been taken away while the brain felt the fear and the link between the two weakened persistently. Decaying like the rest, I longed for my body, but I was trapped in my mind. Or better saying, something trapped my mind and took it away. It took ages for my mind to die, but it finally did. Not by some disease or old age, but simply because there came a point that it surrendered itself to me. When I felt my mind die, I finally came back. The sun was shining. My phone battery had died out. I went home. I'm not quite sure how I drove, but I reached my apartment. When I looked at the mirror, I saw it. My face was covered in gray dust. The same dust I watched cover everything. It's all over my body. I feel it sticking to me. Sometimes it seems that the layer is thickening more and more. I've tried washing it away. The water always comes clean, but the dust stays. People don't seem to mind it. So I go to work every day and pretend I'm not slowly drifting into abandonment. Time reclaimed a piece of myself that night. Something I'll never get back.